Right. So nice to have a chance to gather back again for meditation. Thank you all for giving us the chance to come together and reinforce each other's good meditation habit that we're building. So um, it's always easier in a group. Most things are easier in a group. So powerful to have this nice collection of friends here. So why don't we begin, as usual, with some meditation just to settle our minds? So, our first practice meditation, this is our opportunity to begin to gather our attention, to begin to get control of our minds. So the first practice of meditation can often be just tidying up the room around us. Maybe a little too late for us to start with that, but we can always have that as a habit, tidying up the room around us, removing distractions, putting devices on do not disturb mode, even for a few minutes. And then finding a comfortable position, finding that balance where we're not likely to fall asleep and we're also able to settle in a bit. We disengage the fidgeting in our hands, the movement of our legs, and so forth. Often helpful to close or partially close our eyes just to begin to reduce the possible sources of distraction. Now, that does not mean that distractions stop. It just means there are fewer sources of distraction. We're left with ourselves, our mind, some sounds around us, some feelings. And one of those feelings we can tune into is the feeling of our breath, just taking a deep breath in and out. Another breath, and we just invite our entire body to relax, just like melting. Often so much tension we can hold and accumulate as we go through our days. Just giving ourselves permission to relax, like melting that tension. And we can ask ourselves, what is most important for us to focus on? What is most important right now? We allow ourselves to become more aware of our breathing, each breath as it comes in and out, just as a way of anchoring our attention to something more grounded than just our thoughts. Our mind will always try to fly away. But our body is still here. Our body is still sitting, just pulsating softly and slowly. Sometimes it can help us to find a bit of an inner smile. Sometimes having a smile on our face will change our mood. But even imagining an inner smile with our inner organs being pulled up a little bit, just very gently, as opposed to feeling heavy, we feel a bit uplifted, both physically and mentally. And as we relax and breathe, we try to notice some slight sense of well being, just some sense of peace and comfort, relaxation and well being. This is if we experience such a good feeling, we can just notice how we didn't have to do anything for this sense of peace to arise. It arises naturally. It's just the natural resting state of our mind is to be happy and peaceful if we're not disturbed, if we're not harboring some, holding on to some negative thoughts and feelings. We spend so much of our life very busy, very active, largely because we don't have a sense of well being. But strangely enough, that well being is not too hard to find if we can make our mind peaceful. we always tend to follow our feelings. We tend to go with what feels better or what we imagine will lead us to feel better in future. But if we can never find a sense of well-being, we will always be acting frantically, but never finding the satisfaction we're hoping for. With each breath, we can imagine that we're breathing away any distress, unhappiness, imagining it in the form of dark smoke, leaving our nostrils and disappearing into space. As we breathe in, we imagine that we're inhaling bright white light, which fills our body and mind, bringing a sense of joy, peace, comfort, uplifting feeling. With each breath, breathing out our worries, negativity, and unhappiness and distractions in the form of black smoke. Breathing in happiness, peace, and freedom in the form of white light. And then we can develop some warm feeling of gratitude towards all those who have helped us to get to this place in our life. A feeling of warmth, appreciating their kindness. We develop a wish to give back benefit to this world, to the people around us, in whatever ways we can. And then with this good motivation, we can open our eyes and rise from our meditation. So I wanted to talk tonight a little bit about meaning and craving, these two things, meaning and craving. And as a central point between those, this topic of feeling. And so, like we introduced in the meditation, um, if you are lucky enough to be able to be at peace temporarily, and your body's at peace, your mind is at peace, there is a natural good feeling that can and will arise. So it depends on your personal experience and circumstances, but eventually, as our mind settles, and the more our mind settles, there's a natural good feeling that arises, and that's very lucky for us, right? That there's a tendency towards where our mind is naturally a little bit skewed towards pleasure, towards happiness, towards peace, the natural peaceful state. Um, if there's nothing else going wrong. Now, the if our mind becomes profoundly peaceful, this joy will become profoundly blissful, which is interesting. But even in our normal waking state, there can be some degree of peace and happiness just as is arising through the midst of the whatever disturbance there might be in our mind. And so our feelings relate to how peaceful or how disturbed our mind is. So if you're sitting here just all peaceful, but then all of a sudden you remember someone that you can't stand, right? Then your mind can just flip into unhappiness. Doesn't matter the outer circumstances. You just become just so angry. Just something about them just really gets you. Right? You become unhappy. Similarly, even if you're in the midst of chaos, you've got an injury or something, but if you bring to mind something that makes your mind peaceful, then you'll feel happy, right? Um, even when you have physical pain, you can be mentally happy if your mind is at peace. So there is this. It's not, I think, well understood, well known in our society, but there's a natural relationship between our feelings and the level of peace or disturbance in our mind. If your mind is really agitated, it does not feel good. You're a little bit uncomfortable. Also, if you don't feel good, your mind tends to become more agitated. Like when you're sick and kind of shifting around, fidgeting, and uncomfortable. So the two go together. Our feelings are the central link that links information with action, right? So there's what we do and then there's what we know, but they're linked by how we feel. So you know something and then it makes you feel a certain way and then that determines what you do. We do things that we think are going to make us feel good, and we do things that we think are going to help us to avoid pain. Now, sometimes we're very focused on immediate pleasure and getting rid of immediate pain. And sometimes got a bit more discipline, a little bit more of a sense of delayed gratification, we can focus on long-term happiness and pleasure, even if there's some short-term pain. So that's where there's some discipline that can come in, and a discipline that we need in our life. Because if you go to the grocery store, for example, and taste test every single item in the grocery store, the things that taste the best are not necessarily the best for you, right? The things that taste the worst are not necessarily the worst for you, right? You need spinach, you need a certain amount of kale in your life, right? Um, so and it's an acquired taste. Right? You can develop a refined, acquired, subtle appreciation for these tastes, as opposed to like Hostess Twinkies and so forth. So just as one example, so we're very driven and governed by our feelings. And I think I mentioned this the other day, but there was a talk I heard recently from Yuval Noah Harari, the author of *Sapiens*, and he boiled all of our feelings down into two. He said, your feelings are amazing, right? Because they're basically reducing all of the information that you're getting into some single bit of information, like good, bad, pleasant, unpleasant. And our feelings are all in two categories, one of two categories, either focused on survival or focused on, as he framed it, mating. But the idea with survival is pretty clear. It's, can we stay alive in this life? Can we stay alive? How long, how well can we stay alive? Now, the thing about mating is it provides some possible way to live on past your own death. That's the theory with reproduction. Some little bit of you lives on even after you die. And so now that's evolutionary point of view. But what we do as human beings, we identify not just with our body. For example, we identify with our ideas. So we want our family name to live on. We want to have, like, Saxena Global Enterprises, and like have our name, live on beyond us. Or we want to have our ideas live on, or our influence. We can be a mentor for other people, like a friend. My dad used to coach my brother and I to live according to the Boy Scout motto: always leave the world a better place than you found it. Still a great life mission. Leave the world nicer place than you found it, like Boy Scouts try to leave a campground cleaner than they found it. So this is a way of finding meaning beyond just this life. So survival and then meaning, right? And the way he broke it down, without necessarily getting into the details, is that all of our feelings are kind of organized around one of those two things. And survival is very oriented around fear, that sense of fear. How afraid are we? And so there's a lot of stuff that can trigger our survival anxiety, including how people look at us, our reputation, and so forth, how much fear we're living with. And versus how much confidence that we have that we're going to survive. Now, once the basic survival needs are taken care of, once we're not worried about our own survival, then we can begin to turn our attention to others. And so, for example, when we think about helping a friend, when we think about offering advice or how we can be supportive and so forth, often, typically, this is because we want to have some meaning, some benefit, give some benefit beyond just ourselves. That's the sincere motivation to try to help others, is to find a sense of meaning. And finding a sense of meaning can gives rise to feeling, right? Both survival and a sense of meaning gives rise to a feeling, and feeling is what guides and directs us. So we try to guide our life towards how we think we're going to survive, and try to guide our life towards how we think we're going to find meaning. One of the questions that was asked up front is, if we're trying to help someone and they're struggling with something like substance abuse, how can we help? What are appropriate boundaries and so forth? So one thing to understand about substance abuse is that our feelings can be, our feelings are not a perfect indicator of what's going on, right? Our feelings can be hacked. Um, and so just like, the Hostess Twinkie versus kale, don't necessarily, your feelings don't necessarily give you the wisest advice about diet. So one of the challenging things with like drugs, alcohol, or anything else that's addictive is it can give us a feeling that is better than any other feeling that we ever have in our life. And and it's almost like giving us a sense of meaning and purpose in our life. It's like, this, I've never felt this way before in my life. This is amazing. This is what I was born to do, right? Like, this is just natural. And so if those parts of our mind get triggered, stimulated, they can appeal to this very, very deep part of our mind that basically says, this is what I'm here to do. Now, once you've gotten, and from now, we all have that tendency, right? We all have cravings. We all have cravings for something. We have preferences for food and music and companionship. Um, and addiction is just a craving, and a series of habits that are just deeply, deeply built around fulfilling those cravings. The problem is that some of these things are so pleasurable, generate such a strong sense of pleasure in our mind, it's extraordinarily hard to say no to, right? So addiction is just something that is just overwhelmingly difficult to say no to, overwhelmingly easy to say yes to, and as a result, just overwhelmingly difficult to not follow that path, right? It takes, and so the traditional advice in the world of addiction counseling is that people typically have to hit rock bottom to actually realize that they need to change. And there has to be something from their side that says, basically, I'm not going to survive. My pursuit of pleasure has gotten so desperate that it's basically undermining my ability to survive. Now, what's interesting is if you look at homeless communities, many of them are very tightly tied with drug addiction. And some people who are homeless, it's temporary because of terrible circumstances and so forth. But some people are just more comfortable, right? Like being in where their main focus is just on fulfilling that wish for getting another hit and so forth. And so it's very hard to help people to break out of those cycles. So what we can do is to try to get some empathy and some understanding and some feeling for how we don't like other people telling us what to do in general. Like, most people don't have too much humility when it comes to listening to others, often to their detriment. So people really do make bad decisions on an ongoing basis because of not listening to others who may have wise, helpful advice. And sometimes it's not really possible for us to intervene from the outside in somebody else's behavior. And we need to have look at our own mind and our own tendencies towards craving, and how when we've found things that just feel like so right, we follow that internal guidance, whether if it's wrong or right long term. So it's good for us to understand other people from the point of view of our own experience as best we can. And that foundation of knowing that we may not be able to help somebody else, and it is up to them and so forth, is then the foundation for trying to help if we can, right? And trying to help people to find, for example, alternatives. There's another common saying in the community of addiction counseling that addiction is a spiritual disease. It is a sort of a misdirected search for meaning, um, and that people really are trying to find something that is amazing and beyond their limited selves and so forth. And so helping people to find um, a more peaceful sense of meaning. For example, finding, I know sometimes people can move into a very different mental space through being in nature, for example. If they have some spiritual connection through a spiritual practice, that can be a way of uh, grounding us and helping us to find that peace coming from inside and beginning to oppose those tendencies towards craving. Or some people can find a transformed state of mind through music and so forth. So some of these are ways that we may be able to introduce people to practices, situations, and so forth that can help them to navigate a different course, to realize that there are ways of finding happiness and meaning and peace other than through following their cravings. But our ability to do this partly, uh, but it's difficult. And one way we can know it's difficult is just looking at our own tendencies, right? And just continuing to work on our own ability to stand up against our own cravings and knowing and watching as our mind has more energy or less energy. Like late at night, we're tired, much more likely to give in to, you know, eating food or watching TV or things that we at other times might not have thought were the best thing that we could do, right? So when our mind is tired, we don't necessarily make good decisions. So we can just have some appreciation and respect from our own experience of how hard it is to guide our own behavior, and recognize that the best we can do is to try to model a good example for people, to try to provide good advice, and then to provide support as best we can, but knowing that um, it's easy to it is easy to fool ourselves. Also, it's easy to want to be a hero and intervene and sort of help somebody else and feel like we have some superpowers to lift people out of their difficulties. When, in fact, if we had superpowers, we would probably use them to build our own, habits in different ways than we have right now. So we have power, but we don't have infinite power to help others. And one thing with addiction is it can lead to manipulative behavior, right? It can lead people who ordinarily wouldn't lie or deceive. It can lead them to deceive and want to take more than we're able to give. So it's a tricky situation without necessarily a clear, clean answer. But keeping a good intention for others also is a way of not getting too worried about the present. Also thinking about the potential that everybody has the potential to find real um, to change their minds, to find real peace, and that sometimes people have to struggle with things like addiction for a long time, sometimes years and years before they're able to really transform that, and it becomes a foundation for much greater wisdom. Often, you know it's not at all uncommon, especially these days, that people fall into these patterns, but it can be the source of real transformation and wisdom if people are able to fight their own way out of those tendencies. And so keeping an eye towards that future possibility without allowing ourselves to be too discouraged about the present circumstances. Life is difficult. It is hard even to life is surprisingly hard to navigate, I think. Even just to manage to do your taxes and maintain your car, and maintain a job, and so forth. There's all these ways to get messed up. maintain our exercise regimen, health, diet. It's all way more complicated than it feels like it should be. So that humility in ourselves is something that we can model. And that humility is something that people will learn from us and take from us. Um, and it is part of the gift that we can give to the people around us. Again, modeling our own behavior, activities like humility and so forth, giving good advice as best we can, and then helping others um, materially, for example, but knowing that we can't really solve other people's problems. Only by changing their mind can people solve their problems in a deep way. Okay, so those are some thoughts on this topic of meaning and craving that uh, you may find beneficial. I'll offer that for your contemplation. So why don't we take a few minutes? Just in conclusion, what we can do is we can bring to mind people. We can close our eyes in meditation, take a breath or two just to settle back in, and then we can bring to mind people that we care about deeply who may be struggling, maybe with addiction, maybe with fear, loss, feeling of powerlessness. And we can think these people are just like me. Very temporarily, I may be more fortunate than they are, but it is those fortunes change very quickly. In an instant, I could be in their place, and they could be in my place. We just gently hold a feeling of love and connection for these people. Just think, may they be well and happy. May they be free from suffering and fear. May they be well and happy. May they be free from suffering and fear. And then we can conclude by imagining these people becoming free from all of their fears, their sufferings. Just think how wonderful it would be for everyone to find real meaning in their life, to find perfect satisfaction and happiness. And then we can open our eyes and rise from